There are moments in television history that don't simply mark the end of a program, they mark the end of an era. The cancellation of The Benny Hill Show in 1989 was one such moment. For over 3 decades, Benny Hill had been a fixture of British living rooms, a comedian so beloved and so widely watched that his name had become virtually synonymous with British humor itself. At his peak, more than 20 million viewers tuned in every week to watch his slapstick routines, his cheeky wordplay, and his madcap chases set to that unforgettable bouncing theme tune. He was exported to over 100 countries. He made audiences from Tokyo to Texas double over with laughter. He was, by every measurable standard, a phenomenon. And then, almost overnight, it was over. The story of how the Benny Hill Show came to an end is not a simple one. It is not merely the story of a network executive making a cold business decision, nor is it simply the tale of a comedian who ran out of ideas. It is something far more layered and far more human than that. It is the story of a man who refused to change in a world that was changing rapidly around him, of a television industry caught between commercial loyalty and cultural responsibility, and of one particular sketch, one scene, that became the breaking point after years of mounting tension. To understand how a single piece of television comedy could bring down an empire built over 30 years, you have to understand the man who built it, the world he was performing in, and the moment when those two things finally, irreparably collided. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born on January 21, 1924, in Southampton, England. His father was a circus-trained clown who had transitioned into the more stable profession of surgical appliance fitter, and his mother was a homemaker. It was a modest, working-class upbringing in a city that, while not without its charms, offered little in the way of glamour or spectacle. But even as a young boy, Hill had a gift for making people laugh. He was a mimic, an observer, a child who studied people on the street and stored their mannerisms away like a mental archive waiting to be drawn upon. Before comedy became his profession, Hill tried his hand at a remarkable variety of occupations. He worked as a milkman in the early mornings, driving a cart through Southampton streets. He was a drummer in a dance band. He served as a driver and stagehand for traveling theater companies, spending more time watching performers than actually performing. Each of these experiences, humble and unglamorous as they were, fed into what would eventually become his comedic sensibility. Benny Hill understood ordinary people because for a good chunk of his early life, he was one of them. His transition into professional comedy came gradually. He began performing in music halls and clubs in the late 1940s, developing a style that blended the broad physical comedy of the great silent film era, think Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, with the innuendo-laden punchlines of British music hall tradition. He had an instinctive talent for timing, that elusive quality that separates a funny comedian from a great one. He knew when to pause, when to rush forward, when to let a look or a gesture carry an entire joke without needing a single word. Television discovered him before most people had even purchased their first set. His first television appearance came in 1949, and by 1955, The Benny Hill Show had its official debut on BBC television. The early episodes were modest affairs, produced on small budgets with limited resources, but even then the ingredients that would eventually make Hill a global superstar were present. The physical comedy was inventive and energetic. The characters were broad but recognizable, and Hill's ability to inhabit multiple roles in a single episode, playing both the fool and the straight man, the young and the old, men and women, demonstrated a versatility that was genuinely impressive. Through the late 1950s and 1960s, the show grew steadily in both ambition and audience. Hill moved from the BBC to ITV, where he would remain for the bulk of his career, and the production values improved significantly. The sketches became more elaborate. The cast expanded to include a rotating roster of comedic performers who became almost as recognizable as Hill himself. The musical interludes, the parodies of popular films and television programs, the fast-paced chase sequences that became his signature. All of these elements coalesced into a format that felt both uniquely British and somehow universally appealing. By the 1970s, Benny Hill was not merely a successful comedian. He was a cultural institution. The Benny Hill Show was one of the most watched programs on British television, regularly attracting audiences that modern broadcasters can scarcely imagine. And internationally, the show's success was nothing short of extraordinary. Syndicated across Europe, North America, Australia, and beyond, Hill became one of the most recognized British faces in the world, arguably more famous abroad than any of his contemporaries. In France, he was adored. In the United States, his reruns aired on local stations across the country, introducing American audiences to a brand of comedy they found both foreign and irresistible. What made him so internationally successful was precisely what made him so commercially durable at home. His comedy required very little translation. The slapstick transcended language barriers. The visual gags needed no subtitles. The broadly drawn characters, the leering old man, the dim-witted authority figure, the buxom young woman oblivious to the chaos around her, were archetypes that audiences everywhere recognized instinctively. Benny Hill had found the common denominator of human laughter, and he exploited it brilliantly. For all its success, The Benny Hill Show was built on a formula that had been largely unchanged since the program's earliest days. This was both its strength and, ultimately, its greatest weakness. The sketches followed familiar templates, the bumbling authority figure brought low by circumstance, the romantic misunderstanding played for maximum physical comedy, the speeded-up chase sequence with Hill at the center surrounded by an assortment of scantily clad young women. It was broad, it was fast, and it was, by any serious critical standard, deeply unsophisticated. Benny Hill knew this. He never claimed to be making art. He was making entertainment, and he drew a clear and unapologetic distinction between the two. In the rare interviews he gave during his career, he spoke about comedy in almost mathematical terms, about timing and rhythm, about the mechanics of a joke, about the difference between a laugh that comes from the gut and one that comes from the head. He believed in comedy that worked immediately and completely, that did not require analysis or reflection. You watched a Benny Hill sketch and you laughed or you didn't. There was no middle ground. This philosophy served him extraordinarily well for decades. But it also meant that Hill was essentially immune to the kind of evolution and adaptation that keeps a comedian relevant across changing cultural landscapes. While other performers of his generation, and the generation that followed, were finding ways to update their material, to incorporate new social realities and changing attitudes into their comedy, Hill remained anchored to the sensibility of the 1950s and 1960s in which his style had been formed. The treatment of women in his sketches was the most frequently cited problem. Female characters in the Benny Hill Show existed almost exclusively as objects of desire or as comic foils to Hill's lecherous, bumbling male characters. They were dressed to emphasize their physicality, they rarely spoke lines of any substance, and they were almost always defined entirely by their relationship to the men around them. To audiences of the 1960s and much of the 1970s, this was unremarkable. It was simply the way comedy worked, a reflection of broader cultural assumptions that were so deeply embedded as to be nearly invisible. But the world was changing. The women's liberation movement of the 1970s had fundamentally altered the cultural conversation about gender representation. By the 1980s, feminist critique had moved from the political margins to the mainstream, and the media, television in particular, was being scrutinized in ways it never had been before. Audiences were beginning to ask questions about what they were watching and what it said about the society that produced it. Critics who had previously dismissed concerns about sexism in comedy as oversensitivity were finding those arguments harder to sustain. For Benny Hill, these cultural shifts were essentially background noise. He acknowledged the criticism occasionally, gently, always with the same defense. It was just a joke, nobody was really being hurt. The women in his show were willing participants who understood what they were signing up for. And there was a constituency, a large one, that agreed with him entirely. His ratings remained strong well into the 1980s. The letters from loyal fans continued to pour in. As far as Hill was concerned, the critics were a small and humorless minority, and the audience, the real audience, the millions of ordinary people who watched every week, were still very much on his side. He was not entirely wrong about that. But he was dangerously wrong about one thing. the audience was not the only constituency that mattered. To understand why 1989 became the year everything changed, it is essential to understand how dramatically the British television landscape had evolved over the preceding decade. The 1980s were a period of remarkable creative ferment in British comedy. A new generation of performers and writers was emerging, armed with a sharper political consciousness and a determination to do something different with the form. Shows like Blackadder, with its sophisticated historical satire and genuinely brilliant writing, demonstrated that comedy could be intelligent and funny simultaneously. Only Fools and Horses proved that working-class characters could be treated with warmth and dignity rather than simply mocked. The Young Ones was chaotic and anarchic in a way that made older varieties of controlled slapstick seem almost quaint by comparison. French and Saunders, starring Dawn French and Jennifer Saunders, was doing something genuinely revolutionary. Comedy written by women, featuring women as fully realized human beings rather than props or punchlines. These programs were not merely more progressive than the Benny Hill Show. They were, by the late 1980s, being recognized as superior in almost every measurable way. Better written, better performed, more sophisticated in their construction, and more genuinely reflective of the society their audiences actually lived in. The contrast with Hill's aging format was becoming harder to ignore with every passing season. ITV was aware of this contrast. The network had supported Benny Hill loyally for decades, and there was genuine affection for him within the organization. But there was also a growing unease. The show was expensive to produce relative to its evolving cultural cachet. Younger audiences, the demographic that advertisers prized above all others, were gravitating toward the newer comedy programs. And the complaints, from feminist organizations, from critics, and increasingly from ordinary viewers writing to the network, were becoming both louder and harder to dismiss. The executives at ITV found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. On one hand, Benny Hill still delivered substantial audiences and had been a cornerstone of their programming for decades. On the other, the network had an image to maintain, and that image was being complicated by their continued association with a comedian whose attitudes toward women were becoming, by the standards of the day, genuinely problematic. They were looking, whether consciously or not, for a reason to act. And in the spring of 1989, Benny Hill gave them one. The sketch itself, by the standards of what Benny Hill had been producing for 30 years, was not especially unusual. Set in a doctor's office, a recurring scenario in Hill's repertoire, it featured Hill as a bumbling, leering physician, and a succession of young women in various states of revealing attire arriving for consultations that became increasingly farcical. The physical comedy was energetic and well executed by the technical standards Hill had established. The punchlines were exactly what anyone familiar with the show would have expected. What made it different was the moment in which it aired. By 1989, the cultural context in which that sketch was received had shifted so dramatically from the context in which similar sketches had been produced and watched throughout the 1970s that the gap was almost impossible to bridge. Viewers who might have laughed at the same basic scenario a decade earlier found themselves watching it with a discomfort they couldn't quite name but couldn't quite set aside either. The humor felt not just dated but actively uncomfortable, a relic of a set of assumptions about women that the audience was, in growing numbers, no longer willing to accept as harmless fun. The backlash that followed the broadcast was immediate and, by the standards of 1989, before the internet, before social media, before the instantaneous amplification of public opinion that we take for granted today, remarkably intense. Feminist organizations issued formal statements. Television critics who had been writing increasingly skeptical reviews of the show for several years now had a concrete example around which to crystallize their objections. The letters that arrived at ITV following the broadcast were, in unprecedented numbers, negative. Even some of Hill's longtime supporters in the press found themselves struggling to mount a defense. For ITV, the decision that followed was not made quickly or without internal debate. There were those within the organization who argued that canceling the show would be an overreaction, that the sketch was no worse than dozens of others Hill had produced over the years, and that abandoning a performer of Hill's stature over a single controversy set a troubling precedent. But the arguments on the other side were ultimately more compelling. The show's costs, the shrinking youth demographic, the sustained criticism from cultural commentators, and the reputational risk of continued association with material that was increasingly being labeled as sexist, all of these factors combined to make the cancellation feel not just defensible but necessary. Benny Hill was informed that his services would no longer be required. The man who had been one of ITV's greatest assets for the better part of 3 decades was let go in a conversation that, by all accounts, was brief and businesslike. There was no tribute program, no celebratory retrospective, no grand farewell. The show simply ended, and with it, to all intents and purposes, Benny Hill's television career. To tell the story of the Benny Hill show's cancellation without telling the story of what happened to Benny Hill afterward would be to tell only half a story. And the half that follows the cancellation is, in many ways, the more affecting and the more revealing of the two. Hill was genuinely shocked by what had happened. He had known, of course, that there was criticism of his work. He had read the newspaper pieces and heard the debates on radio and television. But he had convinced himself, perhaps too easily, perhaps with the particular blindness of a man who has been successful for so long that failure seems almost categorically impossible, that the audience's loyalty would protect him. He believed, right up until the moment it wasn't true, that the millions of people who watched and enjoyed his show were a more powerful constituency than the critics who objected to it. In the years that followed the cancellation, Hill attempted to rebuild his career. He met with producers and network executives. He discussed possible formats for new programs. He flew to the United States, where his reruns continued to air on American television, to explore opportunities there. None of these conversations came to anything. The industry had moved on, and the appetite for a new Benny Hill vehicle, at least in Britain, had essentially evaporated. He retreated increasingly into private life. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Teddington, not far from the studios where so much of his show had been made. Friends who visited him in this period describe a man who was quiet and thoughtful, who spent much of his time watching old films and reading, but who was also, beneath the surface, profoundly lonely. Hill had never married. He had had relationships over the years. There were women who were important to him, and he to them. But none of these relationships had ever developed into the kind of enduring partnership that might have provided ballast against the professional isolation he now felt. His relationship with fame had always been complicated. He had sought it, obviously. No one spends a lifetime in show business without a powerful desire to be seen and appreciated, but he had never been entirely comfortable with its consequences. He was famously private, famously reluctant to discuss his personal life in interviews, famously suspicious of the parasocial intimacy that celebrity culture demands. When the fame receded, it left behind not a man who was relieved to be out of the spotlight, but one who found the absence of public recognition far more painful than he had expected or was willing to admit. He continued to receive royalties from the international syndication of his shows, and his financial situation, while not opulent, was comfortable enough. But comfort is not the same as contentment, and by the early 1990s, the people who knew Hill best were worried about him. He seemed diminished, not physically. He was not in robust health, but neither was he visibly unwell, but spiritually. The energy and the drive that had sustained him through 50 years of performing seemed to have left him. On April 19, 1992, Benny Hill was found dead in his apartment in Teddington. He had suffered a heart attack. He was 68 years old. What made the discovery particularly poignant, and what the press reported with a kind of solemnity that suggested even his critics recognized the tragedy in it, was that he had been dead for several days before his body was found. In the end, the man who had spent his entire professional life surrounded by performers, crew members, producers, and the invisible but somehow palpable presence